They told me to water the plants and double-lock the doors like I was a housekeeper they could trust, but not bring along. You're too old for long flights, Mum. Just watch the house. That's what Edward said, his voice light, casual, almost rehearsed. He didn't look me in the eye when he said it. Clara, his wife, offered a half-hearted smile, the kind people give to waitresses or postmen, not mothers. My granddaughter Emily barely looked up from her phone, her thumbs busy snapping away at a screen that didn't have room for me in its frame. Then the three of them climbed into the black van, luggage neatly packed in the boot, boarding passes on their phones, sunglasses already perched on their heads, despite the gray morning. They drove off, windows down, laughing about Greek sunsets and grilled octopus, Emily shouting something about blue rooftops and Instagram stories. I stood on the porch, tea cooling in my hand, and watched the taillights vanish at the bend of our quiet suburban road. I didn't say a word. I just waved. 3 fingers raised stiffly like a salute. They didn't notice. Inside, the silence arrived before I closed the door. It was the kind of silence that doesn't just fill a space. It claims it. I walked back into the kitchen and switched off the kettle, though it had already gone cold. For a moment, I just stood there, hands braced on the counter, the hum of the refrigerator loud in the absence of voices. They hadn't asked if I wanted to come, not once, not even as a joke, not even for show, because they had already decided I was too old, my knees too stiff, my schedule too empty, my presence too easy to overlook. I was just Maggie Holloway now, not Mum, not Gran, not the woman who raised Edward, who nursed Clara through flu when Emily was teething, not the woman who'd worked 2 jobs after Paul died, who bought their first dishwasher, who babysat without complaint. Just Maggie, convenient Maggie, house watcher, plant waterer, quiet, reliable, easy to leave behind. I thought that would be the worst part. It wasn't. The next morning, after a night spent staring at the ceiling and sipping tea that had gone cold twice, I found the envelope. It was wedged halfway through the letterbox, still in the travel agency's branded packaging. My name wasn't on it, but the handwriting was familiar. Clara's. Inside were their plane tickets, paper tickets, oddly nostalgic. 4 seats. Edward, Clara, Emily, and Emily's spare seat for extra legroom. Departure in 3 days. Heathrow to Athens. Seats together. Unstamped. Unsent. I stared at them for a full minute, my fingers trembling slightly as I held the envelope. It felt like someone else's problem, like a mistake that belonged to another woman's life. But it wasn't. It was mine. They hadn't even remembered to take their tickets. I took them to the kitchen, laid them on the table next to the newspaper no one else read anymore, and made tea. Because that's what you do at my age when something strikes you in the chest. You make tea. You wait for the shake in your hands to stop. You busy yourself with something ordinary so the extraordinary hurt doesn't swallow you whole. But my hands didn't stop shaking. They trembled when I opened the drawer where I kept my old brown address book. Trembled as I flipped through the pages with names of people long gone, old friends now phone numbers disconnected. Then I found the travel agency's card, still there from when Paul and I booked our last trip to Cornwall. I rang them. A girl answered, cheerful, chipper. "Good morning, Skybound Holidays. Alice speaking. How may I help you?" "I'd like to cancel 4 tickets to Athens," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. A pause. "Can I ask why, ma'am?" "No," I replied. "Just cancel them." There was silence on the line. Then a very quiet, almost fearful, "Of course." I wrote down the confirmation number. I placed the pen back in its holder. Then I made another cup of tea. This time I took it to the living room, the one with the armchair I used to rock Edward to sleep in, the one where Paul used to sit and hum old jazz songs while tying his shoelaces. His photo was still on the mantel, still young, still smiling. He'd been gone 20 years. If he were here, he would never have let this happen. I'd been so many things in this house: a wife, a nurse, a secretary, a cook, a fixer of broken toys and broken hearts. And then, slowly, invisibly, I had become only one thing: Grandma. Not Maggie, not Mom. Just a background figure. Silent, necessary, taken for granted. I stared at the cancelled tickets again. The silence was heavy in the house, the kind that presses on your chest like a blanket you didn't ask for. Then I stood up, walked into the hallway, opened the drawer where I kept my passport. Just in case, I'd always said. The pages were still valid. My savings account held just over $10,000. Another $4,000 sat quietly in premium bonds. No debts, no obligations, no one needing me. Not really. I sat back at the kitchen table, and I booked a flight, one seat, aisle, to Athens. Then I rang Joan, my neighbor across the road. "Would you mind watering the plants next week?" I asked. "Of course, love," she replied. "Going anywhere nice?" "Just a little trip," I said. I could hear the smile in her voice. Well, it's about time. That afternoon, I packed a small suitcase, comfortable shoes, a navy blue dress I hadn't worn since Paul's funeral. Not because it made me sad, but because it made me look good, and I had forgotten what that felt like. I placed a soft scarf beside it, the coral one Emily once complimented and then forgot. I checked my phone. No messages, no missed calls. Not that I expected any. Not from Edward. Certainly not from Clara. They were too busy being sun-kissed. That night, I sat on the porch. The street was quiet. The hedges rustled faintly in the wind. I thought about what they'd say when they found out. If they found out. Would they be angry? Shocked? Embarrassed? Would they call? Maybe. Maybe not. It didn't matter. Because for once in my life, I wasn't staying behind. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was afraid, but because something in me had finally woken up. A part that had dozed off sometime after Paul died, lulled into the rhythm of routines and favors, and could you just babysit on Saturday? Until suddenly, I had become a piece of furniture in my own life. Now, I was packing for myself. I laid the navy dress carefully across the bed. Next to it, I placed a pair of low-heeled walking shoes, a cardigan soft from years of use, and a zippered pouch with my essentials: passport, medication, cash, and the emergency credit card I had never dared to touch. I'd kept it for Edward, I always told myself, just in case he needed help. He didn't. The suitcase I chose was small and slightly scuffed. It still had a baggage tag from 2003, from a trip Paul and I took to Cornwall. It smelled faintly of lavender sachets and old adventure. I packed light, not because I didn't need much, but because I didn't want to be weighed down. In the morning, I brewed a cup of tea, fed the cat next door through the gap in the fence like I always did when Joan was away, and double-checked my list. I didn't forget anything. I even remembered my reading glasses, tucked beside the battered novel I had started 6 times and never finished. Before leaving, I stood in the middle of the living room, looking around. The wallpaper I'd chosen with Paul. The small dent in the floorboard where Emily dropped her baby rattle. The photo of Edward at 6, missing a front tooth, beaming at me from the mantelpiece. None of them waved goodbye. I locked the door behind me, left a note for Joan on the hallway table. Gone to see the world. The plants are yours. Then I stepped out onto the front steps with my suitcase rolling behind me. The sky was overcast, the air cool. My neighbor's curtains twitched as I walked past. I gave them a small wave. Let them wonder. At the train station, I bought a black coffee and drank it standing up, pretending the slight tremor in my fingers was from the caffeine and not anticipation. No one noticed the elderly woman alone. People in Britain are trained not to. The train to Heathrow was uneventful. Loud announcements, stale air, businessmen tapping away at laptops. I watched the countryside roll by, green and damp and so familiar it was almost forgettable. The airport, however, was something else entirely. It had been over 30 years since I'd flown anywhere. The last time, Paul had done everything. Printed the boarding passes, managed the bags, spoken to the staff. I had just followed, trusting him like I always had. Now, I was the one navigating the maze. Security was a blur of trays and shoes and polite but tired airport staff, repeating instructions like hymns. I moved slower, yes. My knees didn't bend like they used to, and my shoulder ached when I lifted the suitcase. But I managed. At check-in, the young woman at the counter barely looked up as she handed me my boarding pass. When she finally did, her face shifted for a moment. Surprise, maybe, or mild respect. "Traveling alone?" "Yes," I said. "Enjoy your trip, ma'am." It was a phrase she probably said 100 times a day, but I held on to it like a souvenir. I found my gate, sat near the window, and watched as planes lifted into the sky like promises kept. Around me, families bickered, couples took selfies, and children screamed into iPads. I didn't mind the chaos. I liked it. It made me feel invisible in the best way. No one stared at me. No one told me I was too old to be there. For once, I was not anyone's mother or grandmother or problem. I was just a woman in a navy dress, going somewhere. The flight was delayed by 40 minutes. I didn't care. When they finally called for boarding, I stood without hurry, wheeled my case to the end of the queue, and smiled at the woman scanning my pass. She didn't smile back, but that was fine. I walked down the narrow bridge toward the plane, my shoes clicking softly against the industrial carpet. The scent of jet fuel and recycled air hit me like a memory. I felt something loosen in my chest. Not joy, not fear, just possibility. Seat 14C, aisle. I placed my bag in the overhead bin with a little struggle, then sat down slowly. My seatbelt clicked into place with satisfying finality. The window seat was empty for now. I breathed in. It was real. I was going. People bustled past me, stuffing coats and whispering arguments about seating arrangements. One man tried to fit a guitar case in the bin and failed miserably. I didn't offer to help. I wasn't here to fix things. Just as the cabin door was closing, a man slid into the seat beside me. Early 30s, wedding ring, polite nod. "Long trip?" he asked, more out of habit than interest. "Long enough," I replied. He smiled faintly and said nothing more. I appreciated that. As the plane taxied down the runway, I clutched my armrest, not out of fear, but out of something deeper, something primal. A part of me still expected someone to stop the plane, drag me back, say, "There's been a mistake," but no one did. And then we were airborne. The ground fell away. The clouds rose to meet us. The engines roared. And I was free. I closed my eyes and let the hum of the flight settle into my bones. I drifted, not quite asleep, not quite awake, the kind of state where grief lives and memory breathes. I dreamt of nothing, just white noise. And when I woke, we were already over the sea, blue, endless, alive. It hit me then. I had really done it. I wasn't here for postcards. I wasn't here to make a point. I wasn't even here to forgive anyone. I was here because they had told me not to come, because they had left me behind, and I refused to stay there. When we landed in Athens, the air was thicker, heavier. It smelled faintly of citrus and old dust. The airport was bright and strange, and humming with foreign syllables. I moved slower, but with purpose. I found a taxi stand, fumbled through a conversation with a young man whose English was better than my Greek, and handed him a slip of paper with the address of a small pension I had booked online. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine. The woman at reception was warm, middle-aged, and kind. She called me Madam in that charming, old-fashioned way, that reminded me I had not always been invisible. My room was simple: white walls, tile floor, a window with shutters that looked out onto a sleepy street. I placed my suitcase gently against the wall and sat on the edge of the bed. I didn't cry. I just stared at the floor. Grief doesn't always come in floods. Sometimes it's a quiet sitting, a stillness that presses behind your eyes like unspoken things. Then I stood, unpacked slowly, hung the navy dress in the wardrobe, slipped off my shoes, and opened the window. The street below was silent. A cat stretched across a sun-warmed ledge. The scent of baking bread floated up from somewhere I couldn't see. I closed my eyes and smiled. Not wide, not long, just enough. This was the beginning. Not of a vacation, but of something I had owed myself for years. The next morning, light spilled gently into the room through half-closed shutters, warm and buttery. It wasn't the frantic brightness of English summer. It was slower, heavier, golden, like honey poured over a sleeping city. Maggie Holloway woke before the alarm she hadn't set. The bed creaked as she sat up, her joints protesting but not unkindly. She stood by the window for a long while, watching a street that had no interest in hurrying. A woman on a bicycle pedaled past with a basket full of oranges. A child balanced a loaf of bread twice the size of his head. The air smelled like yeast, olives, and a hint of exhaust, alive and imperfect. She brewed the little packet of instant coffee left by the pension's kind receptionist and drank it on the balcony. It wasn't good, but it was enough. And for once, enough felt like plenty. Later, she dressed in a light blouse and linen trousers, tied her hair back with a scarf, and slipped on the sandals she hadn't worn in years. They were surprisingly comfortable. Downstairs, she asked the receptionist, Effie, as her name tag read, for somewhere to walk. Not tourist, Maggie said, struggling slightly with the phrasing. Somewhere quiet. Effie smiled warmly and scribbled on a small notepad. Try Anaphiotica, she said. Old, beautiful, no crowds. Maggie took the note, folded it like a treasure map, and thanked her. It had been a long time since someone gave her directions that didn't begin with, just stay here. The streets narrowed as she walked, the buildings growing older, quieter. Pale white houses with cobalt shutters leaned into the lanes like old friends sharing secrets. There were pots of geraniums balanced on crumbling walls, cats dozing in doorways, and bougainvillea vines spilling over rooftops as though the city was too full of life to be contained. She didn't take pictures, not because she didn't want to remember, but because she was too busy actually seeing. She passed a man selling figs out of a crate, a dog sleeping beneath a faded closed sign, a woman humming to herself as she watered a balcony garden. No one looked at her twice. No one stared at her walking alone. No one asked, "Where's your family?" She was just another person in motion. It was a peculiar kind of freedom, this anonymity. She had spent years being defined by others: mom, grandma, widow, volunteer, the one who always remembered birthdays, the one who stayed home just in case someone needed her, the one who'd quietly forfeited her seat so everyone else could be comfortable. Now in Athens, she was simply Maggie, and no one called her old. She wandered for hours, pausing to catch her breath on a worn stone bench tucked into the curve of an alley. Around her, the world unfolded at its own pace, measured, unhurried, disinterested in productivity. She liked it. When her feet ached enough to make her pause, she found a tiny bakery with a striped awning and a counter full of unfamiliar shapes. She pointed at something round and golden, and the young man behind the counter smiled. "Good choice," he said. She took her pastry and a small plate of olives to a table outside and sat, alone but not lonely. It was the first meal she had eaten in years, without looking at her phone or waiting for someone else's conversation to include her. No one was expecting a text. No one needed her opinion on dinner plans or babysitting schedules. or whether she'd be free next Tuesday. No one was watching to see if she smiled enough. She chewed slowly. She tasted everything. Afterwards, she walked a bit more. Not far. Just enough to stretch the day into something that felt real. She passed a postcard stand and paused. The images were sun-drenched and oversaturated. Temples, columns, blue sea. She sifted through them with idle fingers until one caught her eye. A quiet view of a side street, shadows stretching long, a single cat perched on a windowsill. She bought it. Back in her room, she sat at the desk and turned the card over. For a moment she hesitated. Then her fingers moved on their own. Dear Emily, guess where I am? Greece. The sea is bluer than you can imagine. I hope school's going well. Eat something green every now and then. Miss you. Love. Gran. She didn't write to Edward. Or Clara. They didn't need to know. Emily might not even receive it before she got home. But it wasn't really about the delivery. It was about the act, the choosing. She sealed the card and tucked it into her bag. That evening, Maggie wandered to the edge of the Plaka district, found a small restaurant nestled into a hill, and took a table in the back courtyard under the branches of a lemon tree. The waiter called her Madam. He didn't rush her, didn't hover. Just brought water and waited for her nod. She ordered moussaka and a glass of wine. Her knees hurt and her back was sore, but it was the kind of soreness that comes from living, not waiting. When she returned to her room, the postcard was still in her bag. She'd forgotten to post it. She laughed quietly to herself. Tomorrow, then. She brushed her teeth, folded her clothes with the neatness that had been drilled into her by decades of motherhood, and sat on the edge of the bed. For a long time, she didn't move. Not because she was tired, but because she felt still in the deepest part of herself, not frozen, not numb, still. Like a lake at dusk. She didn't think of Clara, or Edward, or the fact that they had left without even pretending to miss her. She thought of the old woman she saw earlier that day, leaning out of a window with a basket of tomatoes, wrinkled, vibrant, humming a tune that had no lyrics. She thought of a life lived forward, not around others. And she thought, perhaps for the first time in decades, I belong to myself. She turned off the lamp, lay back against the pillow, and slept the deep, quiet sleep of someone who didn't owe anyone anything for the night. In the morning, she posted the postcard. The postbox stood beside a weathered cafe. A man inside was sweeping the floor. As she dropped the card through the slot, she felt a small thrill in her chest, like the echo of a bell struck softly but clearly. Then she sat outside and ordered coffee. Real coffee this time. Rich, bitter, served in a tiny ceramic cup. She drank it slowly. She didn't look at her phone. No one was waiting for an update. No one had asked if she was okay. She was starting to think. She was more than okay. As she stood to leave, the cafe owner called after her. "Have a lovely day, miss." She turned and smiled. The honorific was wrong, but the sentiment was right. And for the first time in a long while, the title didn't matter. Because in Athens, she wasn't Gran. She wasn't Mum. She was Maggie Holloway. And no one, absolutely no one, called her old. The cafe was quiet that morning, just the clink of cutlery and the distant cooing of pigeons on a nearby rooftop. Maggie Holloway sat at her usual table, the one by the window with the terracotta planter that held more dust than flowers. She was gently buttering a slice of toast, not because she particularly liked toast, but because her hands needed something to do, something precise, slow, careful. The knife trembled slightly in her fingers, though she wasn't cold. It was that familiar tremble. Not illness, not age, but all the thoughts she hadn't spoken, all the weight she carried alone. She had just taken a bite when a voice beside her cut through the morning stillness. "You use too much butter." Maggie looked up, startled, to find a woman watching her from the next table. She was perhaps her own age, late 60s, maybe early 70s, with sharp grey eyes beneath half-moon glasses, silver hair swept into a no-nonsense bun, and a wide-brimmed white sun hat that looked both practical and effortlessly elegant. There was a glint in her expression, 1 part mischief, 2 parts directness. Maggie blinked, unsure how to respond. "Better than too little," she replied after a pause, a small, dry smile tugging at her lips. The woman raised an eyebrow in approval. Fair. And just like that, something shifted. Not much, just a slight realignment, like a stone clicking into place. The woman extended a hand. "Rosalind Clark. Roz, if you prefer. Maggie Holloway." They shook hands across the space between tables. Roz gestured toward her half-drunk coffee. "Are you staying at the pension just up the hill? With the blue shutters?" Maggie nodded. "Room number 7. I'm in 6. We're neighbors then." Maggie wasn't used to strangers speaking to her anymore, let alone strangers who noticed things. Most people these days only noticed if she was in the way. Too slow at the till, too quiet at the family table. But Roz seemed to notice without judgment. It was unsettling and oddly comforting. They talked, first about the coffee, too bitter, then the weather, kindly overcast, and soon about the street cats and why the bougainvillea here bloomed so stubbornly, even in dry air. Roz had a voice like gravel softened in water, low, thoughtful, but edged with humor. By the end of breakfast, Maggie was laughing quietly into her napkin. They made plans, without calling it that. "Do you walk in the mornings?" Roz asked. "I do now," Maggie said. And so they did. Not far. Neither of them were built for marathons, but enough to feel like they were tracing the edges of a city that wasn't trying to impress anyone. They took alleys the tour groups avoided, peeked through iron gates, paused to admire cracked mosaic tiles, and the odd street musician playing with more heart than skill. Roz had been a school principal in Bath before retiring. Widowed. "Early," she said, without elaborating. Her tone was matter-of-fact, as if grief was just another credential. Maggie didn't pry. She knew that tone. It was the same one she used when people asked about Paul. Roz wore her independence like a well-fitted coat, not flashy, but perfectly tailored. She noticed things Maggie hadn't seen. A lilac-painted shutter nearly falling off its hinges, a dog asleep in a bakery doorway, a boy gently carrying a watermelon like it was something sacred. She didn't take photos. She just looked. Fully. At lunch, they sat under a canopy of grapevines. The table wobbled slightly, and the waiter adjusted it with a folded coaster. They sipped cold white wine and shared a plate of olives. Roz spoke about her old students, the brilliant ones, the troublemakers she secretly adored, the parent meetings that made her consider early retirement. Maggie listened, smiling. When Roz finally asked, "And your family?" The pause before Maggie answered was heavier than the heat. "They're fine," Maggie said. "They just thought I was too old to travel." Roz set down her glass. "They said that to you?" Maggie nodded, a bit ashamed of how much the words still echoed. Roz didn't gasp or express outrage. She just raised one eyebrow, took another sip of wine, and said, "You're here. So they were wrong." It wasn't a compliment. It was a statement, a truth. That night, back at the pension, Maggie couldn't sleep. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the blades of the ceiling fan slicing slow shadows across the wall. She thought about all the years she'd stayed quiet. Not out of fear, but out of habit. The birthdays she'd cooked for, but never truly celebrated. The holidays she'd paid for, but wasn't invited to join. The decades of being needed only in practical terms. Never as a person. Only as a role. She turned onto her side, clutching the pillow like it might anchor her to something real. In the morning, Roz was already waiting in the courtyard with a folded map tucked under her arm and a gleam in her eye. "Florence," she said. Maggie blinked. Sorry? It's not far. I've always wanted to see the Uffizi. You mean together? Unless you've got a better offer. Maggie hesitated. Old reflexes kicked in. One's trained to ask, should I? Or, what if something happens? But another voice, quieter but stronger, whispered, you've already left once. You can keep going. She smiled. Why not? They booked the train tickets that afternoon. 2 women over 70 buying one-way seats, like students on a gap year. They laughed about it over dinner, though Maggie could still feel the tightness in her chest. That part of her, the one shaped by decades of waiting, of permission-seeking, was still catching up. That evening, as she folded her navy dress into her suitcase, her phone buzzed for the first time in days. It was Clara. The message was short, practical. Did you check the garden? The sprinkler system's been acting funny. No, how are you? No, where are you? No, we miss you. Maggie stared at the screen. She didn't reply. Instead, she moved slower. Not because she was tired, though her body certainly felt the miles, but because she was savoring the moment. The scent of her borrowed soap, the quiet of the narrow hallway, the way Roz had left a tiny bunch of daisies in a cup by the nightstand. Because you look like someone who appreciates flowers without needing a reason, Roz had said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. She wasn't wrong. Maggie didn't cry, but something in her exhaled. That night she turned off her phone, slid it into the drawer. No pings, no alerts. No one else's priorities dragging her back into the waiting room of her own life. She climbed into bed, pulled the sheet to her chest, and let the silence wash over her like a hymn. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like someone hoping to be remembered. She felt like someone moving forward. They arrived in Florence just before noon, stepping off the train into a sunlit platform humming with motion and soft bursts of Italian echoing over the speakers. The air was drier than in Athens, warmer too, and laced with something Maggie Holloway couldn't name. Something old and fragrant, like terracotta soaked in memory. She clutched the handle of her suitcase as Roz led the way confidently, a folded paper map in one hand and her wide white hat perched effortlessly atop her head. She seemed to move through new cities with the grace of someone who no longer needed permission to take up space. Maggie was still learning that. Their hotel was a small pensione just outside the historical center, tucked behind a row of dusty, rose-colored buildings and shaded by an ancient olive tree that leaned like it, too, had secrets. The woman at the desk spoke English with a musical lilt and handed over their keys like she was giving them passage to another life. Maggie's room overlooked a quiet alley where laundry lines stretched between windows like whispered conversations. She opened her suitcase slowly, hung her dress, folded her scarf, and stood for a moment in the stillness. It was a different kind of quiet from Athens. Not soft and slow, but reverent, like the city was holding its breath. That afternoon, they walked. Roz took the lead, weaving through cobbled streets with names Maggie couldn't pronounce. They passed cathedrals that rose like dreams from the ground, their spires pricking the sky, their marble faces worn and glowing. Artists sat on corners sketching strangers, and musicians played without an audience, like the air itself was enough. Maggie didn't speak much, not out of discomfort, but because silence in Florence felt sacred, like a space meant for awe. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt no urge to fill it. Roz pointed out things now and then, the curve of a dome, the shimmer of sunlight on a stone bridge. But mostly they walked quietly, their footsteps echoing softly against the stones laid centuries before them. At the Uffizi Gallery, the queue was long, but they waited without complaint. Maggie watched a young couple kiss too dramatically near the entrance. She smiled faintly. She remembered that kind of urgency, the kind that came before you learned to make space for silence. Inside, the air was cool and hushed. like stepping into a cathedral of color. Paintings loomed, gold-framed and luminous, saints and sinners locked forever in their painted tragedies and revelations. Maggie stood for a long time in front of Botticelli's Primavera. There was something about the way the figures danced, not joyfully, exactly, but with inevitability, as if movement was the only way to survive beauty. "Do you think they knew," she whispered to Roz, "when they painted these? That someone would stand here 500 years later and feel this?" Roz didn't answer. She just placed a hand lightly on Maggie's arm, and the silence between them said everything. That evening, they sat in the small courtyard of a trattoria, lit by hanging bulbs and candles tucked into wine bottles. The tables were crowded with students and elderly couples, all speaking in bursts of English, French, Italian. Maggie let the sound of it wash over her like music she didn't need to understand. She ordered pasta and wine again, not because she was pretending to be someone else, but because the real Maggie, the one she'd buried under years of quiet duty, had always liked pasta and wine. When the waiter brought dessert, Roz leaned back in her chair and sighed contentedly. "You're quiet tonight," she said, not unkindly. Maggie nodded. "Florence doesn't need commentary." Roz smiled. Some people would still give it. They clinked their glasses together gently, like a toast they didn't need to name. Later, back in her room, Maggie stood by the window, watching the street lamps turn the cobbled road to molten gold. A couple walked past, laughing softly, arms linked. A cat darted across the stones, chasing something only it could see. She felt the weight of the day settle into her shoulders, not heavy, not burdensome, just present. She had walked through art that had survived empires. She had stood in silence and felt seen. She had eaten alone and not felt lonely. In the quiet of that Florentine night, Maggie opened the drawer beside her bed and pulled out the small, leather-bound notebook she'd brought but hadn't dared use. She opened to the first page and wrote, "Florence, Day 1. I remembered today that silence isn't empty. It's full of the things we finally have room to hear." She stared at the words. Not profound, not polished, but hers. For so many years, she had made space for others, for Edward's needs, for Clara's comfort, for Emily's moods. Her own voice had been the one most easily dismissed, even by herself. But now, in Florence, the silence had become something else entirely. It wasn't absence, it was presence. The next morning, Roz had an idea. "I want to see the Arno at sunrise." Maggie raised an eyebrow. "Do we strike you as sunrise people?" Roz grinned. "We strike me as whatever we decide to be." So they woke at 5, dressed in layers against the pre-dawn chill, and walked hand in hand with their coffee cups through winding alleys toward the river. And there it was. The Arno lay before them like a ribbon of glass, soft pinks and oranges brushing the water like a painter's final flourish. Bridges stretched across it like sighs. The city, just waking, whispered around them. They didn't speak. There was no need. They sat on a stone bench and watched the sun rise over Florence. Two women in their 70s, with tired knees and full hearts, and no one to answer to. A jogger passed. A bell rang in the distance. Maggie thought of Edward, of the look on his face when she told him she'd be just watching the house. She almost laughed. Roz leaned over and said, without turning her gaze from the river, "Do you regret it? Coming here?" Maggie shook her head slowly. "No, I regret waiting so long." Roz nodded. "I think," Maggie said softly, "I stopped asking myself what I wanted a long time ago. I just went along. For the sake of peace, for the sake of being useful. And then, one day, I forgot that I was allowed to choose anything at all." Roz turned toward her, eyes soft beneath her white hat. "Well, you chose this." "I did." The bells rang again, closer this time. A bicycle clattered over the bridge, and Maggie smiled. Florence didn't need to announce its beauty. It just let you find it. And in its silence, Maggie was finally learning how to find herself. They arrived in Seville just after a summer storm. The air still held the scent of rain, soaked into the orange trees that lined the streets. The cobblestones glistened like they had been polished just for them. Maggie Holloway stepped off the train and into a city that didn't feel like a chapter, but a song. Seville wasn't quiet like Florence. It was alive, pulsing, laughing, bright with color. Buildings wore sunshine like silk, balconies draped with red flowers, and the scent of spices and roasted almonds drifted through the air as naturally as breath. It was a city that moved, a city that dared you to move with it. Maggie took it all in with a strange flutter in her chest. Not anxiety, not fear. Something else. Excitement. It had been years. Roz had chosen the hotel, a small guest house run by a retired flamenco dancer and her husband, whose smile was wide enough to disarm anyone. Their room had lace curtains, hand-painted tiles, and a small courtyard that bloomed with jasmine. That first evening, they sat in the courtyard with sangria in hand, the light gold and long as it slid across the walls. "I've never been to Spain before," Maggie said, watching the petals sway gently. Roz looked up from her guidebook. "You'd never been to Greece either, or Italy." "Yes, but Spain, it's different. It feels louder, more awake. Maybe it's waking you up." Maggie looked at her. "Do I look like someone who needs waking up?" Roz raised an eyebrow. "You look like someone who forgot she could dance." Maggie laughed. "I haven't danced since Paul's retirement party, and that was more shuffling than salsa." Roz smirked. "That's about to change." The next day, Seville wrapped itself around them like a festival. They wandered through the old quarter, their footsteps echoing off centuries-old walls. Street performers played guitars with aching sweetness. Children dashed through plazas chasing pigeons. Locals walked slowly, with the confidence of people who knew how to live rather than just survive. They visited the Alcazar, wandered through rooms carved in lace-like stone, sunlight pooling through stained glass windows. Maggie trailed her hand along the cool stone railings, letting the city's history sink into her skin. Everywhere she turned, something was moving. A curtain fluttering, a fan opening, a dancer's heel striking tile. By afternoon, they were sitting in a cafe, fanning themselves with menus and sipping something cold and citrusy. Roz reached into her bag and pulled out 2 folded papers. "What's this?" Maggie asked, sipping. "Tickets, flamenco. Tonight." Maggie blinked. "Roz, I thought we agreed on slow dinners and early nights." Roz grinned. "That was before Spain. Tonight we see women who burn the floor with every step. You might even remember how to." Maggie rolled her eyes but couldn't stop smiling. "You're impossible." "I'm retired," Roz said. "There's a difference." The flamenco hall was tucked into a narrow street that seemed to shimmer under the low evening lamps. Inside, the air was heavy with anticipation, and sweat and perfume and wine. The room was intimate, no stage, no formal seating. Just a wooden platform in the center, and chairs circling it like an ancient ritual. Maggie sat with her hands clasped in her lap, nervous without knowing why. The first beat struck like a match. A single heel tapped once, twice, 3 times. Then silence. And then movement. The dancer stepped forward, hair pinned high, dress coiled with fire. She didn't just dance, she declared. Her feet struck the ground like thunder. Her arms carved the air. Her eyes told a story Maggie didn't understand, but felt deeply, of sorrow, of defiance, of a woman refusing to shrink. The music grew urgent, fierce. The guitar wailed. The singer bled emotion with every note. Maggie was transfixed. It was not a performance, it was a reckoning. At one point, the dancer spun so sharply that her earrings caught the light like lightning. Her expression was not polite. It was proud, furious, free. Maggie swallowed hard. She remembered something then, not the exact steps, not a song, but a feeling, a moment from decades ago, in her parents' kitchen, barefoot on tile, the radio humming an old jazz tune. Paul had spun her by surprise, laughing. She'd laughed too, off balance, her hair flying, her cheeks flushed. It had been raining. The kettle had boiled over. They didn't care. They had danced. She had danced. She didn't realize her eyes were wet until Roz reached over and gently pressed a tissue into her hand. After the show, the narrow streets were still alive with music and footfalls. Maggie and Roz walked without speaking, the night warm and close. "I forgot," Maggie said finally. "Forgot what?" "That I used to be more than a helper, more than someone who just showed up when asked. I used to throw my head back and dance in the kitchen." Roz didn't say anything for a while. Then, "You still can," Maggie chuckled. "Oh yes, I'm sure the kitchen tile is just begging for it." "I mean it, Maggie." Maggie stopped walking. The jasmine was in bloom again, thick in the air. "I'm 73 years old. I'm not going to become a flamenco goddess overnight." Roz turned to her. "No, but you can become someone who doesn't wait for permission to feel alive." Maggie looked down at her hands. They were wrinkled, strong, marked by decades of service. Washing bottles, packing lunches, folding laundry, wiping tears. Hands that had been busy, needed. And now? Now they were hers again. She raised her eyes. "Let's go back." "To the hotel?" "No." Maggie smiled, the kind of smile that felt like a door swinging open. "To that square with the guitar player. Let's dance." Roz laughed in delight. "You serious?" "Absolutely not. Which is why we must." The plaza was nearly empty when they returned. The guitarist was still there, lost in his melody, eyes closed. The few remaining tourists clapped politely, but otherwise the square was still. Maggie approached him and asked softly, "May we dance?" He smiled, nodded once, and continued playing. The music was gentle now, slower. Maggie turned to Roz. "Do you remember anything from those charity galas we used to endure?" Roz offered a hand. "Only the bits after the third glass of wine." They laughed and began to move. Small steps, soft turns. Hesitant at first. Maggie's feet remembered better than she expected. Her body, tired but willing, responded not with perfection, but with joy. She didn't care how it looked. She didn't care who watched. The tiles beneath her feet were warm from the day. The notes around her were soft and sincere. And then she danced. Not like a young woman trying to impress. Not like an old woman trying to prove she still could. But like a woman who remembered that rhythm had once lived in her bones, who remembered that laughter could come from her chest, not just her mouth, who remembered that being alive wasn't about age, it was about movement. She and Roz swayed and turned and clapped once, twice, and laughed as they forgot the beat and picked it up again. The guitarist played on, smiling without missing a note. When they finally stopped, breathless and glowing, someone clapped. A small group who had gathered silently at the edge of the square. Maggie bowed playfully. Roz curtsied with exaggerated flair, and they burst into another fit of giggles. They walked home slowly. Maggie's legs ached. Her shoes pinched. Her hair was wild. And she felt more beautiful than she had in years. Back in the room, Maggie slipped off her sandals and sat on the edge of the bed. Her feet throbbed. Her heart soared. And for the first time in what felt like forever, she did not dread the morning. She looked at her reflection in the window glass. "Not too old," she whispered. "Just late to the dance." And finally, she forgave herself for waiting so long to arrive. Granada greeted them with a kind of quiet majesty. The city curled around the Sierra Nevada like an old poem, all whispers, arches, and the faded gold of sun-baked walls. Where Seville had been fire and rhythm, Granada was incense and memory. Maggie Holloway felt it the moment she stepped off the train. This was not a city that shouted. It didn't need to. It simply stood, steeped in centuries of prayer, poetry, and the unspoken grace of survival. Their guest house was nestled in the Albaycin quarter, with steep, whitewashed alleys and stone steps that challenged their knees, but rewarded them with views that stole their breath. From the rooftop terrace, they could see the Alhambra across the valley, perched high like a crown of red stone, regal and still. Roz, ever the planner, had a list of places to visit. Maggie, ever the wanderer now, had something else. A small, leather-bound notebook that had begun to fill with pages. Not long, sprawling diary entries. Just fragments, moments, thoughts, memories she hadn't planned to carry, and ones she didn't want to leave behind. They spent the morning wandering the palace gardens of the Alhambra, its quiet fountains bubbling like secrets. Maggie moved slowly through the cool shade of the Generalife, her fingers brushing over carved Arabic poetry, etched into the walls. So much beauty, from a time long past, still speaking softly, without begging to be noticed. In a shaded alcove, she sat on a bench and pulled out her notebook. Granada. Morning. There's a stillness here that doesn't ask for silence, only attention. I am listening. Finally, that evening, after a dinner of grilled vegetables and saffron rice, Roz headed to a poetry reading at a local bookstore. Maggie stayed behind. Not out of fatigue, but instinct. She needed the quiet. She climbed to the rooftop terrace and sat with a cup of chamomile tea, watching the sky darken behind the Alhambra. The last rays of sun painted the stone with a soft fire that seemed too tender to be real. It made her think of all the things she never said, all the things she wrote but never sent. She opened her notebook again and turned to a fresh page. To Clara, I know I wasn't always easy to talk to. I know I filled silences with advice when maybe you just needed me to listen. I hope one day you'll see that I was trying. Clumsily, yes, but with love. Always with love. To Edward. You never had to be perfect. You just had to be present. That's all I ever wanted from you. Not accolades, just eye contact. To Emily. You are the best part of me. And I hope when you're 70, you're somewhere dancing under Spanish stars and not wondering whether your worth depends on what others think of your usefulness. She set the pen down, surprised to find her cheeks wet. It wasn't sadness. Not fully. It was the weight of honesty. The kind that came only when you stopped trying to be understood and simply allowed yourself to speak. The city below began to glow. Lights in kitchen windows. Lamps in quiet courtyards. A dog barked once. A guitar strummed faintly from somewhere unseen. Maggie sat in the fading warmth of the day, her hands still on her lap, the notebook open, her heart not heavy, but full. The next morning, she made a list. Not a grocery list, not a to-do list, not the kind she'd spent decades scribbling on Post-it notes stuck to the fridge. This one was different. At the top of the page, she wrote, "Things I want that no one else gets to approve." And beneath it, to wake up without immediately checking my phone, to take a train without explaining why, to cry without apologizing, to say no, to say yes to joy even if it looks foolish, to stop measuring love by how useful I am, to stop measuring age by what I can no longer do, to begin again, as many times as I need. She stared at the list for a long time. Then, for the first time in years, she added one more line. To write. Just because I want to. The words settled on the page like seeds. That afternoon, she wandered alone to a small shop at the edge of the quarter. It was a stationery store, the kind she would have once hurried past without a second thought. But something drew her in. Inside, it smelled like paper, cedar, and thyme. She bought a packet of handmade cards and a pen that felt smooth and cool in her fingers. Back at the guest house, She sat at the wooden table in her room, wrote Clara's name on the first envelope, and began. She didn't explain everything. She didn't try to fix the past. She just told the truth, that she missed her, that she wasn't angry, just tired, that she was learning how to live again, and that it wasn't too late for either of them. Then she wrote to Emily. Dear Em, I went to a flamenco show in Seville. The woman on stage danced like the ground owed her answers. I think I want to be like her when I grow up. I miss you. Love, Gran. She sealed the letters, pressed a gentle palm to each one, and placed them in her bag. That night, Roz returned from the poetry reading glowing. He read Neruda, she said, tossing her scarf onto the bed. In Spanish. I didn't understand every word, but my God, I felt every one. Maggie smiled. I wrote some words of my own today. Roz paused. Did you? Maggie nodded. Letters, lists, a bit of myself. Roz stepped closer and touched her arm. You've found your voice again, haven't you? Maggie's eyes shone. Maybe not again. Maybe for the first time. They stood in the doorway a while, watching the Alhambra glitter in the distance like a promise too soft to speak aloud. And when Maggie went to bed that night, she didn't open her notebook. She didn't need to. The words were inside her now, alive. The following morning, before breakfast, she walked to the nearest postbox and mailed the letters, not because she expected anything in return, but because letting her voice be heard, truly heard, no longer depended on someone else's reply. She'd written them for herself first, and that, she realized, was enough. The flight home was uneventful, but Maggie Holloway was not. She sat by the window, her tray table up, hands folded in her lap. Outside, clouds stretched like frozen waves, and the hum of the engine provided a soft, steady lullaby. Next to her, a young couple dozed, their heads resting against one another like matching puzzle pieces. Maggie didn't mind the silence. She carried her own now. Not the heavy silence of being overlooked or ignored, but a new kind. The silence of knowing who you are and not needing to prove it. The plane touched down in London with a gentle bump. The familiar grayness of the sky greeted her, a stark contrast to Seville's fire, Florence's hush, and Granada's soul. But this time, Maggie didn't shrink into her coat. She pulled her scarf tighter, her steps measured and sure as she made her way through the terminal. No one waited at arrivals. She hadn't told them when she'd be back. It wasn't a protest. It was a choice. The taxi ride was quiet. The driver asked if she'd been on holiday. She answered truthfully. No, she said softly, gazing out the window. I've been away finding myself. He chuckled politely. Hope you found her. She smiled to herself. I did. Her house looked exactly the same. Same ivy creeping over the porch. Same garden she had once trimmed meticulously, now grown a little wild in her absence. Same door, same key, same creak as it swung open. But Maggie was not the same. She stepped inside, not like someone returning from vacation, but like a woman re-entering her own life. The air smelled faintly of lavender and dust. She walked through each room slowly, pausing in the kitchen where so many of her days had begun and ended. She placed her bag on the table and took off her coat. She didn't unpack, not yet. She made tea and sat at the window, not to watch, but simply to be. The first knock came the next afternoon. Clara stood on the doorstep, arms folded, brows furrowed, lips pursed. A storm carefully held behind glass. I got your letter, she said. Maggie opened the door wider. Would you like to come in? Clara stepped inside stiffly, like she wasn't sure if she was allowed to be angry or relieved. I didn't know where you were. Emily's been asking. Maggie gestured toward the kettle. I'm making tea. Clara exhaled, sat down. You really just left? I needed to, Maggie said. But you didn't tell anyone. Maggie nodded. For the first time in my life, I did something without asking for permission. Clara looked away. You could have at least said goodbye. I didn't know I was leaving forever, only that I couldn't stay here. Not the way things were. Silence settled between them. But it wasn't brittle, just full. I didn't realize you were unhappy, Clara said finally. I wasn't, Maggie said, then paused. I was invisible. That landed. Clara's eyes softened. I never meant to make you feel that way. I know. Another pause. Then, did you find what you were looking for? Maggie smiled. I found someone I used to know. She was underneath the helper, the babysitter, the polite woman who never made demands. I missed her. Clara looked at her. Really looked. You do seem different. I am, Maggie said. They sipped their tea in silence. When Clara left an hour later, she hugged Maggie at the door. It wasn't stiff. It wasn't automatic. It was warm and a little teary. As she pulled away, Clara said, Emily's birthday is next week. She'd love it if you came. Maggie nodded. Tell her I'd love to. But I'm not baking the cake this time. Clara smiled. Fair enough. The following morning, Maggie stood in front of her wardrobe. She reached for the same gray sweater she always wore, then paused. Her hand moved past it, to the red blouse she'd bought in Florence. She put it on. It fit differently than she remembered. Or maybe she just stood taller. At the cafe on the corner, the waitress raised her eyebrows. Back from somewhere warm, Maggie grinned. Somewhere alive. The waitress laughed. Aren't we all? Not always, Maggie said, sipping her coffee. One afternoon, she opened her notebook again, but this time not to write letters. She began a new list. Things I want to learn now, at 73 Spanish. How to take better photographs. How to swim without holding my breath. How to say no with grace. How to say yes with joy. How to tell stories that aren't about duty, but desire. How to leave when the room goes quiet and not feel guilty. How to love again, even if it's just myself. She closed the book gently. Not because the list was finished, but because the beginning was enough. On Emily's birthday, she wore her navy dress and brought a hand-wrapped gift, a sketchbook from Granada. Inside the front cover, she had written, For the stories you'll draw before you know how they end. Love, Gran. Emily clutched it to her chest. I missed you. Maggie cupped her cheek gently. I missed me too. Later, Clara caught her in the kitchen. Are you staying this time? She asked. Maggie looked around the room. The same tile, the same fridge magnets, the same slow hum of a home grown familiar through years of repetition. I'm not going anywhere just yet, she said. Clara looked relieved. Then Maggie added, But if I do, I'll tell you, and I'll expect you to cheer. Clara laughed. Deal. Spring came quietly. Maggie planted tulips in the front garden, not because she was expected to, but because she wanted to see something bloom. One evening, Roz called from Bath. Fancy Portugal this summer? She asked. Maggie grinned. I thought you'd never ask. And so, the woman who had once been asked to stay behind, the woman who had once been told she was too old to travel, too fragile, too much trouble, too unnecessary, was now a woman who booked her own ticket, who chose her own seat, who danced in foreign squares and wrote letters that healed, who returned home with a voice that no longer waited for permission. She had come back, but not backwards. And the house, the family, the world, all of it, would have to meet her where she stood now. Upright, unapologetic, unfolding. The woman who came back different.